Richard Rood, climate scientist for U of M, he was saying that basically every decade now we're dealing with a statistically different climate. So we can't be building for the way things were in the past and expect things to reach some sort of historically established equilibrium. We really need to be planning for the future.
That's the voice of Brian Allnutt, a reporter for Planet Detroit. On the podcast today, we're going to talk about the Venice of Detroit, the Canal District part of Jefferson Chalmers that has been battling flooding in high river waters and trying to figure out what to do about it. We're going to talk about how climate change plays a role in that and how it impacts not just that area, but the region as well. I'm Jared Stays, and welcome to Your Daily Detroit, sharing what to know and where to go in Southeast Michigan. It is Monday, August 21st, 2023. As always, feedback, dailydetroit@gmail.com, or leave a voicemail, 313-789-3211. Would always like to hear from you. Let's get into that conversation. Joining me on the line, Brian Allnutt, a reporter for Planet Detroit, who has put out a piece that I really want to talk about because, one, it hits close to home for me. I'm somebody from the east side. Two, talks about one of, I think, the city and the region's most special neighborhoods with all kinds of interesting assets and stories. And three, the things that are making this story relevant and kind of pushing this together, I think touch all of us no matter where we live. The title is Climate Costs Imperils Detroit's Unique, Diverse Jefferson Chalmers Neighborhood. As part of a bigger inundated series that Planet Detroit is doing with some support. Brian, what drew you to work on this story and do so much with it?
I've been reporting on Jefferson Chalmers for years now, and they're facing a lot of different threats, but I think really kind of at the center of this is it's just the specialness of this neighborhood. It's also a place that I've just spent a lot of time in with friends, and it's really special seeing this article come out. It's apparent that a lot of people, even lifelong Detroiters, had no idea this neighborhood even existed, since it's kind of tucked away on the east side on the border of Grosse Pointe Park. So I think highlighting what an interesting place this was and the fact that it's in danger.
It's known as the Venice of Detroit, and it's due to its canals, which, if I remember correctly, they're not natural canals, but they're something that have been there so long that they've become a part of the fabric of the neighborhood, right?
Yeah, and so that whole area, like a lot of the areas on the shoreline of the Detroit River, was just a very large swamp. And eventually it was developed, and these canals were put in, but you continue to have the same issues with a lot of water moving through the area that you would have in any place that historically was a swamp.
And there are a lot of homes there.
Yeah, no, I mean, especially along those canals, pretty much all lined with homes. I mean, there are a few areas where houses have been torn down, but it's pretty well populated.
Yeah, and when I visit, you can notice some of the legacy things that are there. Everything from, I believe there's a brick street that's still through there. There used to be a horse raceway, I think, at one point down there.
Yes.
So the real challenge here is that we have increasing waters, and we have a situation where, as I understand it, it's now a FEMA floodplain.
Yes, and so that floodplain declaration came in 2021. These designations are generally out of date by the time they come in. But it was officially declared in 2021, and so that means anyone with a federally backed mortgage needs to have flood insurance.
And that has a lot of impacts for the local residents, right?
Yeah. That can be pretty expensive. Some people who had kind of older rates that were grandfathered in said they were paying $600 a year, but I think it can run into the thousands to pay for that flood insurance. And you also might have to pay it if you take out a credit line on your home. So it could affect a lot of residents. And then on top of that, to manage the overbank flooding, and this is what I kind of have to separate these two things because, like a lot of Detroit, people have issues with basement backups, but then there's also the flooding from the river, which is really what I'm mostly talking about in this article. To try and manage that situation, the city is going to start fining and potentially litigating against people who have missing seawalls or who have seawalls that are in poor condition, and that can cost tens of thousands of dollars. So those could be, really significant costs for low or, even middle income people in the neighborhood, of which there are many.
What are some of the ways that they're looking at addressing these ongoing flooding issues?
Well, it seems like right now the city is really just putting forward that they're going to move forward with this fining and litigation strategy, and that it's going to be up to individual homeowners to, basically get their properties in order. The city also needs to get its own properties in order. They have a number of city-owned lots on the canals that they need to improve seawalls on or put in seawalls. But residents are putting forward their own plan that would involve, the city investing money in seawalls on resident properties, as well as putting in berms and kind of natural buffers along the Detroit River.
Is this something that any of these plans are going to take some time, even if there were funding? I mean, is there funding identified? Is like I feel like there's a lot of moving pieces to this whole thing.
Yeah, I think there were funding sources identified, potentially, for some of the older plans. One of which included a plan that the city presented to basically close off some of the canals that connected to the river, and then put in a removable dam um, on sort of the main channel that allowed for boats to move from the canals into the Detroit River. But residents pushed back on that because they were afraid that the water was going to get stagnant in the canals if that happened, and that also they didn't really trust the city to manage that removable dam.
All these issues, they kind of have one core cause, right? Because I mean, there were always some water issues over there, in one way or another, but they've definitely gotten worse in recent years.
Yeah, and talking about basement backups, people I've talked to said they've never seen the level of basement backups that they have in the last decade or so, where there have been numerous significant rainfall and flooding events in the city. Um, we basically had two 500 or 1,000 year storms in the last decade or so. That's unheard of. And then also with the high levels on the Great Lakes and the Detroit River, which is all the same system, we have seen historic lows and historic highs in the last decade or so. And that's exactly the kind of reality that climate scientists say we're going to see and are already seeing with climate change.
So, in some ways, if you're near water or you're dealing with different water issues, what we did before isn't going to get us to where we need to go in the future. Is that kind of what I'm picking up?
Yes, Richard Rood, climate scientist for U of M, he was saying that basically every decade now we're dealing with a statistically different climate. So we can't be building for the way things were in the past and expect things to reach some sort of, historically established equilibrium. We really need to be planning for the future, and that's going to involve making a lot of changes in terms of, building more dynamic natural infrastructure, wetland buffers and things that can respond to some of this flooding. But then also in heavily developed areas like Detroit and Jefferson Chalmers, where you really can't build out that kind of natural production, we probably need to build, higher flood barriers, or potentially think about, relocation. which is not something that I heard anyone in Jefferson Chalmers endorse. Um, it's people say that it's just such a special neighborhood that the city needs to put the effort into making sure it remains viable. And one thing, unlike certain coastal areas where you just have this sort of inevitable set level of sea level rise, it's not clear we're looking at the same thing in the Great Lakes. Like, it is predicted that we will see more high water, more, potentially record high water, but it's not just going to be this like continuous increase that can't be defended against. Of course, you can't predict the future. And so I think researchers are still trying to figure this all out.
Well, and not that the other issues don't touch on this, but when you start talking about things like relocation, I think about places like New Orleans that I've seen. I've visited the Ninth Ward. You also get into issues about equity, gentrification, who moves, who can afford to stay, where do people go. That starts to open up what seems to me would be a Pandora's box of issues.
Yeah, no, I mean, it is a politically very fraught discussion. Research has shown that these relocation programs have reduced risk for people who have participated in them, but they've created their own problems where they've tended to drive white flight, where white people in racially mixed neighborhoods have moved to whiter areas. Um, and so, something similar could happen in Jefferson Chalmers, but it seems like what we're seeing right now is kind of the opposite movement, where the area is actually getting whiter. Um, People who are relatively more well off are moving into the neighborhood, and that might be because those people can afford the cost of climate in that neighborhood. That rather than escaping risk, it's actually a place where it might be only the people who can afford to manage the risk can live in that neighborhood. So when you think about getting help for people who have been there and often been there for generations, a lot of it's about helping people stay in place and be able to afford to manage the costs of living in that kind of environment.
I don't remember if you touched on this in the article, but I think about the ongoing issues there. And you've got a much higher seawall on, although it's still the city of Detroit, the Alter or Grosse Pointe side
Mhm.
of the berm versus the Detroit side. And that area of Grosse Pointe Park is not a FEMA flood zone because that infrastructure, was put in there. It's a significant difference if you take a look at it off of one of the bridges or something like that.
Yeah, no, it's very dramatic that continuous seawall along Fox Creek has protected Grosse Pointe Park and really created this dramatic difference when you look at the flood maps. And it's a stark racial difference where people on the majority white side are protected and people on the majority black side are not. And but I think it also kind of points to something that people brought up a lot, was that it might just be very difficult to get individuals to address this on their own, even if they had even if they had the means. Um, Not only are seawalls expensive, but there are very few contractors who do this sort of work. People said it was difficult to get somebody down to even do an estimate, and it could take a really long time. So many people in the neighborhood said it just doesn't make sense to approach it that way, that the city or someone needs to be involved to kind of help organize this work, potentially do bulk purchasing and ensure that there's a continuous seawall on the Detroit side.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not the smartest guy in the world, but I can't help but think, you could put up, 4 or 5 sections of seawall, but if you've got one that isn't done yet or doesn't get done, that's going to have of limited benefit.
Exactly. Yeah, you need a continuous seawall, or else water is going to find its way through there, and that area is still going to be in the flood zone. I mean, I think the goal here is to get the neighborhood removed from the FEMA flood map by getting those seawalls or some other protection in place. Because as it stands right now, people blocks away from the canals who might not even, be especially at high risk of having flooding, at least, from the Detroit River and the canal system, are still on the flood map and still have to pay for that flood insurance.
Well, it's not just the insurance, but it also holds up other sorts of projects. I remember having a conversation with some of the folks from Jefferson East where there are some projects that are kind of stalled because they're unable to get any kind of financing or grants or things like that being in that flood map.
I don't think it's entirely impossible to get federal money for affordable housing in a FEMA flood zone, but it's very difficult. And there is an executive order, advising that some of those grants don't go to flood zones. So in terms of maintaining the racial and economic diversity, which several people said, that was a selling point of the neighborhood for them. They appreciated that there were different types of people living there, but they wanted it to stay that way. They wanted there to still be a mix. So in order to keep it affordable for different sorts of people, you want to be able to have some of those affordable housing projects. And you probably need to remove that FEMA flood designation, but there's no guarantee that putting seawalls or these other defenses in place will do so. Those defenses could help. I mean, they definitely would help. But people I spoke to with FEMA said that you also have to look at the interior drainage in the neighborhood. So the water that's coming in, on the side of the wall where people are living, and all that's going to be influenced by Detroit's sewer infrastructure and the ongoing issues with basement backups and flooding that people have been seeing, all over the city.
I know you're going to be following this for Planet Detroit going forward, as you have in the past. And I encourage people to follow you on Planet Detroit. But before I let you go, what are a couple of the immediate things that people should look for that are up ahead with this story?
That's a good question. I mean, the city said that they're not going to start fining people or pursuing litigation in regards to missing or poorly maintained seawalls until they get all the infrastructure on city-owned property, where it needs to be. And they said that that's going to happen by the end of the year. So I think we'll see if they actually make that deadline. And then, 2024 could be an interesting year in terms of seeing how the city actually decides to move forward with this. If they really just start going after residents, or if maybe they, begin looking into a different plan for the neighborhood.
Well, Brian Allnutt, Planet Detroit. You can, of course, go to planetdetroit.org. Thank you so much for your time. It's been a while. So glad to have you back on Daily Detroit.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
All right, friends, I don't really like to end shows on a bad note, but today I do want to acknowledge a loss in the greater Detroit community. In case you didn't know, Eastern Market CEO Dan Carmody and his wife Vivian, also very active in the community in her own right, were hit by a car on their way to dinner Friday night at Lafayette and St. Aubin in the city of Detroit. Sadly, Vivian died and Dan was injured. Eastern Market's president, Katie Trudeau, will act as CEO while Dan recovers and will get the support of their board of directors and board president, Cindy Paskey, who heads up strategic staffing solutions in the New Center area. My thoughts are with Eastern Market, all the people involved with that, all the friends that I have, listeners that I know that are connected to this amazing couple, and I send my condolences. With that, we are done for today. Feedback, as always, dailydetroit@gmail.com, 313-789-3211. we will be back all 5 days on your Daily Detroit. Lots of great stuff, including a special guest for tomorrow that I think you'll enjoy a lot. With that, I'm Jer Stays. Remember that you are somebody, and we'll see you around Detroit.